Hello everyone, my name is Jamie Walker and I'm going to be covering with you my PowerPoint on considerations for ELL evaluation. Let's get started. Maybe. There we go. First of all, what is ELL? Well, ELL stands for English Language Learners. Oftentimes, these students are coming from non-English speaking homes or bilingual homes and are in the process of learning their English language skills. These students oftentimes need modification with their daily classroom instruction as well as modifications in their homework instruction. Students sometimes speak with dialects or differences in language that are related to their culture. How might these differences impact assessment approaches in oral language? Well, first let's cover dialect. What is dialect? Dialect is how we pronounce or use our vocabulary. Oftentimes, throughout the whole let's start with the world. First, in the world, there are several English-speaking countries, such as Great Britain, Canada, or Australia. These places, they do speak English, but they use their phrases and how they pronounce their vowels very differently than we do here in the United States. And even here within the United States, we have many different dialects. For instance, people who come from the South may speak differently than people in New York. You know, you hear those on TV, the New York accent. Our accents, our dialects. Same from New York to Maine. There are several different dialects. And that goes for other languages as well. And then in our textbook, Wig and Simel, they speak about code switching. Code switching is how we use our dialects differently, how we speak from between friends and family or work and home. For example, my mother, she is Filipino and she speaks very good English, how I speak, I guess, my dialect. But when she calls back home to her parents or her brothers, she tends to code switch into a dialect that's more familiar with her family. Different phrases and different ways that she uses her wording or even pronounces her words is a lot different. For example, for her and I, we say mom. But when she talks to her ma and pa, yes, those are different words, but she normally wouldn't speak that way. So she uses a different dialect. And she pronounces her A's differently, things like that. Things that are more familiar from when she's with them. That could be, for example, somebody also who speaks very professional sounding at work. Then they get around their friends and family and they use different dialects to how they would speak in their group setting. So, furthermore, impacts on assessment approaches in oral language. How do these dialects of different cultures or languages affect our approaches and assessment in oral language? We had learned that our English language standards are a lot different. So, for example, in a written standard test, somebody who speaks in a different dialect, although they may know the answer, the way they phrase it or do it in their dialect or way is not to our English standard. So, when assessing an oral language, even in person, teachers or educators who aren't well educated on how to pick up on those things may have a hard time with an oral language assessment. I feel like personally it affects it because there is no consistency in assessing. The book gave several different examples of different assessment approaches when it comes to oral language. I personally don't feel like there is a good way, and I'm sure they're coming up with many other ways to assess people. especially since oral language, cultural differences in languages is a lot more common in our areas now. But because of our English standards and how we approach these things, although we can approach it where teachers are coming at it with more questions for their understanding, and that's kind of what the assessments can be, their understanding of the lesson instead of exactly what they're doing, I still don't feel like it's as consistent because teachers may not know different dialects or phrases or how things are used. So yes, I do think how these differences impact assessment approaches in oral language is very difficult to pick up. Secondly, interventions. What intervention options are available to students who are English language learners if they need additional services? There are several different interventions that teachers can use within the classroom to help ELL students. For instance, direct vocabulary, and that may be vocabulary in our textbooks or readings, but also everyday vocabulary. For instance, fire drills. These are very important to make sure that ELL students, as well as all other students, are educated and understanding of vocabulary. So giving direct vocabulary for many things, especially important things for ELL students. The I do, we do, you do approach, which is the teacher will model and demonstrate. Then the we do is the teacher and the student will model and demonstrate. And then you do is giving the student the opportunity to take what they've learned together in order to do it on their own. Graphic organizers, as well as many other visual aids, even transition aids like music, like audio, would be helpful for ELL students. Small groups, partners, or buddies, working in groups, specifically a buddy who may speak the student's first language would be very beneficial to that student if that is possible in the classroom. Having a buddy, but making sure that all students, groups, and partners are responsible, well organized, and able to help without impacting their own learning as well. Gestures, giving, like I said, other visual aids for ELL students, and attitude. A student can pick up on, as well as anyone else, if you have a good attitude towards something, or if you're more, I guess, disappointed. You wouldn't be disappointing in your students, but those facial expressions and everything give everything to the student. That's very important to make sure that you're holding up a good attitude and giving those clues. And last but not least, over and under identification for EL students for special needs services. Why are students over or under identified? Students are often under identified for special education services because the characteristics of dialect and culture are often similar to those students who need special needs, as well as teacher training. Sometimes teachers aren't trained well enough to pick up on those differences or what students will need. They're not given the time to make that decision, and discouraged. Sometimes teachers are discouraged to give those EL students into the program because there's a stigma sometimes in some schools in doing that. And then sometimes students are over-identified for special education services because they're too quick to jump on the gun, saying, oh, it can't be their dialect, it must be special education. Or they're not given the correct assessment tools, they use them inappropriately. And special education services are sometimes used as a dumping ground for students that they just don't feel like they have the tools or needs or time in their own classrooms to make those decisions. So And that's very unfortunate for students as well, because sometimes students are left in special education services when they just needed a little bit more time to, they're English language learners. They're learning their English language. So they're not giving them enough time and day to learn it or have the opportunity to learn it before putting in special education. And those students sometimes actually fall behind even more being in special education because they're focusing on that instead of focusing on their English language learning to do that. So that is my presentation on ELL considerations. I learned a lot doing this assignment, and I hope you did too. Thank you.